Welcome back to Converge. It is September 23rd, and I'm delighted to have Rahul Bhargava with us today. Thanks for being here, Rahul. I know you're far overseas in Singapore, the beautiful city of Singapore. Thanks for taking the time. Um, we're going to cover some broad topics today that pertain to cross-border payments. Obviously, some very exciting ones too, because these are uh, exciting and transformative times in this space. So I'm very grateful to have your expertise to share with our audiences today around some of the G20 roadmap for faster payments targeted to the year 2027, as well as Project Nexus, a Bank for International Settlements initiative that you have certain experience and expertise on. So great to have you, Rahul. Welcome. Can you give us a little background on where you come from and what you do these days?
Thanks a lot, Alex. First of all, great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. There's a lot happening in payments in general and financial services. So, great to be having this chat. Very timely. So just a quick introduction. I've had about 21 years of experience in emerging payments, banking, and technology. Been half my life in banking and spent time with consulting and technology companies. And the last year, I was heading the payment market infrastructure strategy globally for Swift. I've opened my management consultancy firm in Singapore this year called Avivate, and I'm currently consulting with the World Bank and a few other paytechs, banks, and central banks on various topics. Excited to be here and look forward to the conversation.
So small companies, no big deal, just the World Bank. But great to have that expertise with us today. So we expect a lot. But could you, just to start things off, can you give a quick overview for those unfamiliar on the G20's goals for cross-border payments in the coming years, and then, if you don't mind, also a little bit on the significance of Project Nexus and what it is really testing for?
Sure, and maybe just to baseline, right, Alex, it'll be good to just set the stage with a bit of what's happening in cross-border payments as well, very quickly, because
Perfect.
the G20, body of work was in response to what's happening, and I think if I look
Hmm.
at it, in the broadest sense, being involved in cross-border payments as well as domestic payments, evolution for a number of years now. I first want to look at the aspect of fragmentation that's happening. There's obviously a lot of innovation, and I think there's a lot of optionality that's coming in, both in terms of legacy payment ecosystems as well as new and emerging forms of ecosystems globally. If I look at the traditional and the most regulated side of commercial bank money and how traditional transaction banking is evolving. There's a whole body of work being led by transaction banks and Swift in terms of developing a better standard and looking at ISO 222, for example, adoption globally, and offering really more instant and frictionless services across the board. So that's one body of work. There's another space where you have the domestic market infrastructure is also evolving to adopt ISO 22, renew, go towards more instant payments, and really kind of matching this drive for more instant frictionless payments with the number of instant payments that have gone live globally. And plus, in terms of even RTGS is going 24/7, etc. And all this you will see as part of the G20 agenda overall, right? It's in places and where cross-border instant, for example, is being placed squarely, as well as ISO 22 adoption, etc. On the other front, you have kind of now spaces which are lying between sometimes the regulatory and unregulatory space. You have wallets, you have the stable coins, and you have evolution of that space where there's definitely a lot of adoption, and there's a lot of I think discussion as well on the regulatory side of what should be the right approach in many markets which are still immature. And then there is, you have a whole host of kind of largely unregulated or less regulated markets as well, evolving, which are on the crypto side, and others which are kind of integrating together. So payments as such is getting quite complex in the cross-border as well domestic space. And the G20, was essentially a clear response to this, complex environment, and especially looking at the cross-border space. they came out with specific guidance on what should be goals for the entire payments ecosystem, looking at specifically cross-border payments, and they laid down under four criteria: speed, access, transparency, and cost. And these are kind of baseline criteria to arrive at the next kind of service level. They set goals to be achieved by 2027 and then subsequently 2030. The idea being for speed, for example, they would like to achieve 75% of payments to be settled within an hour, and the rest within one business day. That was one kind of clear criteria. On access, they want to ensure that there's minimally one option available for consumers to use a particular payments corridor, and essentially have access and availability to remittances and digital forms of payments to the population within a country, at least to 90% of those in a country, for example. On transparency, they want to ensure that basic fundamentals of cost and other details are provided upfront and available as part of the information made available to the customer for making a decision, and transparency provided on that. And lastly, on cost, the idea being to cut down the cost of payments down to 3% of the actual payment value, and further down perhaps to even 1%, depending on the timing and the progression of this. So very ambitious goals as per many, but yeah, this is the kind of structure and direction being pushed forth by the G20, and then evolved further by the BIS and other standard setting bodies and guidance.
Great overview. That's a great backdrop. So if we talk more about this roadmap that the G20 has set forward, what are some of the milestones that they've requested from organizations globally to address those pain points? How are companies working together, and how does that tie into what Project Nexus is doing to sort of push this vision and this goal forward?
Yeah, I think the G20 has laid down some key criteria that I've already mentioned in terms of looking at adoption of global standards, looking at cross-border interoperability, and these all are derived from essentially an initial set of 19 building blocks that they'd come out to, and now they've refined it and filtered it further to actually provide specific guidance and more targeted kind of recommendations. The deadlines are still, I would say, open from an ecosystem perspective, from a global perspective, but there are individual projects and individual work streams that are running towards some build-up deadlines, I would say, towards achieving those larger targets. Now, as part of the ecosystem change I mentioned earlier, and also what is being driven by the G20 agenda and cross-border payments, cross-border interoperability and interlinking is one of the topics that has definitely taken hold over the last, I would say, about 7 to 8 years. And this I would say this is in the genesis of instant and frictionless payments being a really strong consumer demand in the domestic perspective from the instant payment systems evolution that's happened over the last few years, and that has also resulted in a strong demand coming into the cross-border space. Now, there were many initiatives that were actually launched about, I would say, 8 to 10 years back that have resulted in this being a key topic in terms of the G20 agenda. Obviously, there were many services, there were many platforms that were already offering cross-border instant availability of movement of money, the classically closed loop systems. But this was also being then considered by the banking and transaction banking community, where, for example, when I was at SWIT, I was leading the agenda for cross-border instant payments, and we launched a global multilateral service to enable that exactly in 2019. So that being a global product, there were a lot of bilateral conversations that were taking place as well, where there were, for example, corridors between Singapore and Thailand established, which is the world's first, and then there were further kind of bilateral negotiations and discussions going on. So as an outcome of all this, I think the idea of providing a standardized option, right, and guidance on how cross-border multilateral settlements can take place. There was an ambition placed to achieve connectivity between multiple national payment systems, into a cross-border payment platform, which is common. And it should be as quick as, if I remember the initial wording, it was as simple as sending a text message, right? And then there was, again, the stated ambition of having a payment within 60 seconds being settled cross-border, right? So this was kind of I would say, the genesis of what, Project Nexus evolved into as a derivation of what the G20 agenda laid out as the ambition to interlink and achieve this cross-border instant experience on payments, and how BIS kind of took that on and established it as an actual working project and program.
So Project Nexus has obviously gone through several phases of development and testing, and now it's in phase 3, or either phase 3 was recently completed, or you're undergoing phase 3 now. Can you describe what this phase entails? Because I know you have had some experience hands-on with this particular phase within the broader experiment. So what is the significance of phase 3 for this whole cross-border picture?
I've been lucky, I would say, to have been associated, with Nexus for some time, and as I said, cross-border instant for the last nearly 8-9 years. In fact, the work I did at Swift essentially was a kind of a precursor to majority of the work that's happened, in terms of Project Nexus and the bilaterals. But so as a virtue of that, and also being in Singapore, I was designated as the lead representative from Swift for the BIS Innovation Hub, and I was looking at this very closely and working with the team very closely as well. Project Nexus essentially, if I look at it, has evolved from an initial, I would say, best practice effort, right? In its first blueprint, it really looked at a lot of best practices of what was happening at the point in cross-border instant payments. So, for example, ensuring that ISO 222 is an adopted baseline, ensuring that there's minimum complexity and change in introducing a multilateral system. So, for example, it envisaged that there should be minimal touch to the existing instant payment systems, but it would interlink instant payment systems using using the least invasive kind of technology with some interfaces, etc. It also looked at adoption of ISO 22 into the API context and really heavily evolve on APIs. Look at, again, best practice processes in terms of pre-validation, for example, proxy resolution, ensuring that the risk is minimized up front before even the transaction is initiated. And also, fundamentals we discussed in detail, for example, the travel rule and FATF compliance across the board. So these are some of the fundamentals which were laid down in 2021 in the very first blueprint, by the team. And then, from there, it has evolved through trials and through review with I would say the global community looking at this problem, and kudos to BIS on really holding fort on that particular aspect. A lot of feedback, a lot of investigation and review went into creation of what today has evolved into a third phase 3 of Nexus. And the intention at this point is to make this theoretical exercise, which has been reviewed earlier, and then it was trialed as well a couple of years back with the 3 payment service providers and central banks, to actually make it more real and make it a sustained business going forward that can actually provide a multilateral cross-border instant payment service, interlinking instant payment systems globally. So that's where we are on phase 3.
Well, that's a good place. That's an exciting place to be. Tell me about what is the prognosis for what the learnings are, what the findings are from Nexus more globally. Will it, remain primarily an experiment with the ASEAN region and Southeast Asia, or do you see this being more applicable for global interoperability eventually? I mean, obviously that I assume would be the goal, but where are you on that sort of? Where's the team working on this, on that roadmap towards sort of global applications?
Sure. So it's important to note that Nexus was designed as a global multilateral solution, right? So that was the initial ambition, pretty much stated. And then, over the course of the review, the trials, came to a point where, the ASEAN 5 formed essentially some kind of a coalition of willing to actually make it move forward in the real sense. So this is a conversation kind of going on, I would say, over the last year and a half. And then what we've seen now with this phase 3 publications is that you have 4 of the ASEAN 5 leaving Indonesia as an observer, and India actually joining the group as a non-ASEAN party. And they were part of the original work on Nexus as well, and have stayed close to this, obviously. So that group of 5, including India, have actually decided to move this forward and establish this as a real operating business. And it's your question on global versus ASEAN, I think the current construct seems to be localized to these 5 countries, but the stated ambition is very clear, right? It's about actually establishing a platform which can scale up to be a global, essentially framework for integrating and interlinking payment systems. So it is a global solution. It's a global platform. It also, clearly states, the ambition to scale with and be inclusive to, integrate across IPSs, that's instant payment systems, and also across use cases. And then also in terms of the, uh, some of the design principles that have laid down have kind of established that they're looking at various types of participants, open access, to the maximum possible extent, and also they are aligning their design principles, to public policy goals for the G20, the UN SDG, and retaining neutrality and fairness. So with all these taken together, the idea of providing a platform which can integrate beyond the 5 is definitely the ambition and the aspiration. And I would personally be looking forward to seeing how the solution, first of all, for 5 progresses, and how it can help in either bridging with other maybe regional ecosystems, or the right bilateral links, or extending the corridors in key currencies, for example, the US, Europe corridor, etc. So there's a lot of potential that exists, and then definitely the ambition is global rather than ASEAN.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to ask, like, from your experience working with the ASEAN region and global payments markets in general, how is Nexus positioned to enable faster cross-border payments, more especially in the regions with different infrastructures and varying levels of maturity? Because we've had a lot of guests on this show, particularly from continent of Africa and other areas where there's just a lot of discrepancy in the infrastructures, the maturity of the infrastructures that are actually built out and ready to go. And given that discrepancy, how do you see projects like Nexus helping to enable more inclusion and bringing those regions into the new payment schemes, despite the large disparities in these infrastructures being built out or not built out?
It's a great question, Alex, and I think this is something I've been reviewing and kind of living for the last many years. When I actually worked on cross-border instant payments, I started from pretty much scratch, looking at how banks and central banks and MIs could actually converge on a common need and a common kind of a solution. And one of the fundamentals that I very quickly arrived at was that we must minimize the impact, right, to the stakeholders that are joining. So if it's an instant payment system, for example, that's getting integrated into something like the Swift solution or into the Nexus platform, it has to by definition minimize the cost to the community and cost to the infrastructure. Otherwise, the friction is too massive to actually implement and get adopted. Um, and
Yeah.
and this underlying kind of principle, I'm happy to say, has been pretty much been a foundation of Nexus from day one. So it stands today as well. And the Nexus scheme has been designed to be incorporated by the member instant payment systems as an addendum to the domestic scheme, right? So it kind of adds on to the existing scope of work. And as the members kind of accept that, right, they need to obviously adhere to certain rules, certain requirements. There are obviously technical changes, and there are some capabilities that need to be built, but it sits on top of what's being already built, and it aims to maximize the usage of what's already existing. It could be local market practices, it could be reusing local compliance and AML, CFT kind of practices. As an example, right, it lays down, for example, the fact that payments could be considered time critical and non-time critical. Now, this is very important from a compliance perspective, because one of the classic problems of taking a domestic instant payment system into cross-border instant is the fact that cross-border payments need to be screened in real time differently. And typically in domestic payment system, there's no screening. So it's actually an additional bill, right? And here, what they've suggested is there could be a designation of payments as time critical and non-time critical. And if it's a time critical payment, then that has to be, simply, if there's a compliance hit in the real-time screening, it gets rejected, right? It just, that's the classic only possibility in an instant situation for further handling, by the sender. But in terms of a non-time critical payment, it can actually be paused essentially, and you could conduct screening without actually crediting the end beneficiary and take more steps essentially to actually ensure the compliance requirements are being met. So these kind of I would say very well thought out implementations of reusability, as well as ensuring best practices are deployed is being used, which is a great way to ensure that it integrates well, and adoption and infrastructure gets taken care of nicely. Yeah.
Great to hear. Turning to the sort of the technological side of Project Nexus and some of these other projects that the BIS Innovation Hub is involved in, we spoke with some of those folks on this podcast as well, and in panels at Money 2020. I have a keen ear listening to the fine details of what really is going into the technological side to make these implementations possible. And of course, we speak a lot about emerging payment rails, new rails on blockchain using digital assets, whether it's CBDCs or stable coins or to be determined digital asset, because it's changing on the daily here. But I'm very curious, what are the sort of actual realities of the technology that's making these projects seem so promising, and in turn will be able to be implemented in a way that is, functional with the existing system, as you mentioned, that's not going to cause friction or a lack of interoperability, because that's the real challenge. So what really makes you excited on the technology side of all this?
Now, there's a lot, and before I come there, let me just maybe state one thing about the business aspect, right? So the way, and that's kind of feeding into the success on the technology side, right? So the fact is that the way Nexus is going to be set up now has been clarified. That's going to be an independent, not-for-profit, limited by guarantee company, or a CLG company, right? It's established to lead the overall governance and management. This will manage the overall scheme and rule book. It develop the product roadmap. You look at the fee models, disputes, etc., and also look at the what is called the Nexus technical operator, right? So there is a kind of a governance body that'll sit across the scheme organization, and there will be a additional governance, and this, by the way, will have a a lead overseer, which could be a central bank or the market infrastructure in that particular jurisdiction where this is finally housed. There's also something called a joint oversight forum, which will be comprising of the this NSO, the Nexus Scheme Organization, and it'll essentially be the central banks and regulators of participating countries, and it'll have two subcommittees driving policy and oversight. So this is kind of the governance and business framework under which then the Nexus a technical operator will actually thrive and kind of build and move. So what is this NTO? This is the body responsible for providing and maintaining the technology and network that supports Nexus. It also looks at onboarding operations and then technical support and things like that. So the day-to-day business operations may be finally outsourced to an NTO, and it may not necessarily be the same jurisdiction as the NSO. So this is kind of one level of built-in I would say flexibility in the way this gets moved, and focused attention on technology by this technology organization, right? Then on top of that, I think when we look at the technology architecture, I think the guiding ambition there is to look at cost effectiveness, look at scalability, resiliency, and flexibility, right? So one of the underpinning aspects has been of Nexus providing a centralized a service, which is actually an integration gateway, right? It's called a shared Nexus gateway. To the instant payment systems to integrate. And these can be, again, as you mentioned, right, the maturity of payment systems is quite varying. So this could be housed in the cloud. And then, could be as seamless with the latest technology, or it could be on premise as well, right? If that's the only model feasible in certain situations. So this is one example of the flexibility being introduced to solve integration challenges as you scale up to meet diverse IPS implementations globally. And this is something which not only applies in ASEAN, as you rightly said. It's a global challenge, right? Different design choices have been taken, and instant payment systems are at different levels. Also, I already mentioned about reusability of existing connectivity investments, for example, between the instant payment systems and proxy directories, payment service providers, indirect models, aspects like that, right? So the idea of reusing the existing infrastructure investment by the community is also key to this technology, aspect. And moving to different form factors of money, looking at how the world is moving towards more optionality to the consumer, digital assets, tokenization, and the real fragmentation I was talking about, right, is something which is definitely another factor for Nexus and the G20 and the BIS to consider. And I believe that the way they have structured Nexus today is really fundamental best practices in movement of money, which will support the extension tomorrow, if needed, to other forms of money, right? It could be CBDCs, for example, as a easy one, should they get traction from a regulatory perspective, or it could move on to other regulated forms of money in the first case, in addition to A2A. And this is a classic problem that is yet to be solved fully, and I'm sure Nexus will have those best practice foundations to actually scale to that quickly. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, and there's other BIS projects that are very much focused on the what versus the how, and there's so many different players participating both in the private and the public sector. So I'm really excited to continue to watch all of these projects sort of come together and shape the new financial system that becomes more digital and more always on. It's an exciting time for sure. So when we look ahead towards Nexus being part of cross-border payments as we know it, what are the practical implications for banks and payment providers around the world in sort of joining into the use case of Nexus and at least getting involved with being able to utilize the learnings from experiments like this? What's the steps that they can take?
Well, I think this phase three publications already provide a fundamental review point for various stakeholders to look at what role they could play in Nexus. And however, obviously, once the organization gets formalized and structured, there'll be more detail available, and that obviously will be ultimately the right review point to look at the right business cases, the right incentives to actually join and be a part of Nexus. There's already strong momentum and interest I see globally in Nexus, and I don't see that dying down as things progress. So it'll be more of interest to see how open and how holistically Nexus is integrated into existing payment ecosystems, and how others adopt Nexus as part of their kind of business, either directly or indirectly. Now there's some factors obviously which drive this, and there's obviously one factor of a lower cost base, right, which is essentially supported already by the Nexus design. I mentioned this is through maximizing reusability of existing investments, looking at global standards like ISO 222, APIs, RESTful APIs, looking at again, from a correspondent banking perspective, best practices like the correspondent banking due diligence questionnaire, and allowing for scale as well, right? So you're kind of allowing for scale in use cases beyond P2P, going into SME and business cases as well. Financial stability, the NSO is key. So there's a whole commercial model, right, that is being also driven where, again, there's clarity being provided on what each particular, stakeholder can actually build out of a business case, right? Even though the driving force is to achieve those G20 targets of getting 3% or lesser cost to the sender. But ultimately, there'll be charges being, considered as fees, which will be applicable to those payments. And the NSO will charge the instant payment systems transaction fee. There'll be fee allocation for the instant payment systems involved, or the settlement service providers or FX service providers. And there's guidance on how that should be structured and what should be charged. The idea being to overall lower the cost, obviously, towards those guiding principles, but yet keep it commercially viable. So these kind of, I would say, optionalities and some more clarity on the economic incentive, right, is key to getting industry participation and the right kind of, stakeholders on day one, and then going beyond that to scale. With the right, business cases and adoption, expectations as they should be. The various factors supporting the success of Nexus being integrated and being adopted by many. The real proof in the pudding will come when the NSA actually survives and thrives, and then we see the reality coming into play economically.
Yeah. Well said. Well, thanks, Rahul. This was excellent overview of a sort of theory area of cross-border payments, which we don't get a lot of a taste of in our day-to-day, work life. So I'm very excited to have had you come and share your wisdom with us on Project Nexus, on the G20, the state of cross-border. Great checking in with you, and thanks again for being on Converge. Hope to have you back.
Oh, lovely. Thanks, Alex. It was a pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to, more conversation on the topic. Payments is exciting, and yeah, I'm sure that there's a lot more to come. Looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you.